The hand goes up first. 5 fingers, then a fist. Stop, hold, don't breathe. Behind him, 4 men freeze mid-step in ankle-deep mud, rifles low, faces blacked with grease and dirt. Somewhere past the wire, a dog that has been quiet for 11 minutes lifts its head. Nobody moves. Nobody breathes. 3 weeks ago, Otis Marrow was a corporal who took orders from a sergeant named Delbert Cranmer, who is now buried under a stone marker at Chiunzi Pass. Tonight he is the one deciding whether 4 men live, based on a fist he's holding in the dark and a dog he cannot see. Behind him, past a ridge lit by a burning outbuilding, is a farmhouse checkpoint called Ponte Alto, the only road through this valley, and the reason a German column is due at first light. His orders are simple and nearly impossible. Take it, and don't fire a single shot doing it. The dog's ears turn. Otis doesn't move his hand. The mortar fragment took Delbert Cranmer through the throat outside Chiunzi Pass, and he was dead before anyone's hands found the wound. That was 3 weeks ago. Otis Marrow was a corporal that morning and a staff sergeant by that afternoon, handed the squad the way you hand someone a weight they haven't asked to carry, because he was next in line, not because anyone standing there believed he was ready for it. His men didn't say anything about it. Pruitt, Okafor, Delisle, and a replacement named Vance who'd been in Italy 11 days. None of them said a word, and Otis understood that silence for exactly what it was. Not trust, not yet. Just the absence of anything better to say. He caught himself doing it more than once in the first week, turning half around to ask Cranmer what he'd do about a route, a watch schedule, a man who wasn't sleeping, before the empty space where Cranmer used to stand reminded him there was no one left to ask. So he drilled the squad harder than the manual called for. Not because he trusted his own judgment, because moving was easier than sitting still with how little he did. There is one road through the valley, and the road runs through a stone farmhouse the Germans had turned into a checkpoint 6 weeks back. Battalion called it Ponte Alto, like it was a place worth naming, and for 3 days intelligence had done nothing but watch it. 2 sentries, a dog that slept in shifts same as the men, a wire perimeter strung tight around the yard, and a Feldwebel, who rotated his watch schedule just often enough that you couldn't set a clock by him. A column was coming at dawn. Supplies, reinforcements. Enough men that whatever this checkpoint was tonight, it wouldn't be that anymore by noon tomorrow. If Otis's squad didn't take it quiet before the column arrived, there'd be no such thing as a quiet night left to have. The valley would become a fight instead, and fights had a way of finding more men to kill than the ones who started them. Command handed it to 5 men. No artillery behind them, no room for a shot fired early, no version of this where noise was still an option once they moved. Anton Griesbach had held worse ground than this. At Kursk, he'd watched armor die by the hundreds before breakfast was over, watched men he'd trained with disappear into smoke that didn't clear for hours, and he'd survived it. Survived it in a way that left him with a soldier's particular arithmetic for what counted as danger and what didn't. Ponte Alto, by that arithmetic, was a quiet posting, a farmhouse, a dog he trusted to wake before he would. 2 sentries who'd proven themselves competent enough that he slept without checking on them every hour. And an enemy he'd read about in the dispatches from North Africa and judged, the way a man judges a report written by someone else about someone else's war, more dangerous on paper than in practice. Americans, green by every account he'd seen, still learning what men like him had learned at terrible cost years earlier. He did not lose ground to enemies he couldn't hear coming. In 4 years of war, across 2 fronts, he had never once had reason to believe that was something the war could still teach him. Otis read the order twice before he said a word to the squad. The way you check a number twice hoping it'll come out different the second time. It didn't. Take the checkpoint. No shots. Dawn wasn't a deadline you negotiated with. It was just the moment the whole plan stopped being possible. He told his men what Cranmer would have told them. Borrowed the voice too. Flat, unbothered. The tone of a man who'd done this kind of thing enough times that it had stopped being a question. Pruitt nodded. Okafor checked his blade without being told to. Delisle didn't look up from the wire cutters he was already field stripping. They believed it, all 4 of them. And Otis understood they believed it, because they needed something to hold on to at 0200 hours, not because his voice had actually earned it yet. Pruitt asked what happened if the dog woke early. Otis said they'd figure it out. It wasn't an answer. It was the only one he had, and he said it like it was enough, because that was the job now too. They moved at 0200, through mud that swallowed most of the sound, and threatened to betray them with the parts it didn't. Delisle worked the wire in short sections, cutting only when the wind moved through the brush loud enough to cover the snap. 40 meters out they went, low behind a stone wall that had probably stood there longer than the war itself, and that was when the dog lifted its head. Otis's hand went up. 5 fingers, then a fist. Don't breathe. Nobody did. Behind him 4 men stopped mid-step and held there, weight balanced on nothing, while the dog's ears turned towards something it couldn't place yet, and might never place at all. 11 seconds passed. They felt considerably longer than that, the way seconds do when a sound you can't take back is one twitch away. Then the dog lowered its head and settled back against the door frame, and Otis brought his hand down slow enough that not one of his men could have said exactly when it happened. The wire was behind them now, cut and pinned back with care that hadn't shown in the doing of it. 2 sentries stood between the squad and the farmhouse door. One slouched at the gatepost, more asleep than not, the other walking a slow loop around the yard on a schedule he probably didn't know he'd fallen into. Otis split the squad without a word, just hand signals. The same ones Cranmer had taught him weeks back on a hillside outside Naples, back when Otis was the one watching Cranmer's hands and not the other way around. Okafor and Vance moved toward the gate. Otis and Pruitt stayed low, eyes on the second man, counting the loop the way you count anything that has to go exactly right. 11 seconds. That was how long it took the man to walk himself out of sight of the house, past the corner of the barn, and into the kind of dark that didn't answer to anyone. Otis had counted it twice already, just to be sure his own nerves weren't stretching the number into something it wasn't. It happened fast, and it happened quiet. The 2 sentries down within moments of each other. No shots fired, no shout that carried past the yard it started in. Otis was through the farmhouse door before he'd fully decided to be, the decision arriving somewhere behind the motion instead of ahead of it, Pruitt a half step behind him with the same look on his face. Inside, a single lamp burned low over a field map someone had marked up with tomorrow's column route, red grease pencil lines running straight through a valley that wouldn't belong to the men who'd drawn them by morning. It wasn't the speed of it that mattered most, though the speed mattered. It was the manner, a position that should have taken a full squad the better part of an hour to clear properly, cleared in under a minute, the men inside barely registering that anything was happening before it had already finished happening to them. Otis stood there a second longer than he needed to, breathing, understanding for the first time that the fist he'd raised in the mud had actually worked. Griesbach woke to a rifle barrel and 4 men he had never heard arrive, and that was the part he would carry for the rest of the war. Not the fact of losing the checkpoint, which happened to soldiers on both sides more often than anyone liked to admit, but the manner of it. The total absence of warning. No dog barking, no wire snapping, no sentry's shout cut short. Just a barrel, and the dark, and men who had apparently been standing over him for some length of time he couldn't calculate. He had commanded men through worse fights than this one. He had lost soldiers at Kursk to shells he'd heard coming from 3 kilometers off, had lost them to tanks he'd watched cross a mile of open ground in daylight. He had never lost anything to a threat he hadn't detected at all. He raised his hands. It was the first time in 4 years of war he had done so without gunfire coming first, and that detail, the quiet of it, the sheer unearned silence, would outlast the memory of the surrender itself. Months later, in a prisoner cage outside Naples, an American interrogator asked Griesbach about the night Ponte Alto fell. He described the dog, the wire, the 2 sentries who never managed a sound between them. He said he had turned the night over more times than he could count, and still couldn't explain how 5 men crossed open ground under a moon bright enough to read a map by, and were inside his walls before he understood they existed at all. The closest he could come to it, he said, was this. Most soldiers, facing wire and dogs and sentries, went looking for the gap in the defense. These men had been trained to treat the defense itself as the gap. Asked if he blamed himself, he said no. He had met good soldiers and brave soldiers in 4 years of war on 2 fronts. What he'd met at Ponte Alto was something simpler and harder to forgive. Men trained not to hesitate at a wall. And the one signal his own sentries never caught, a fist raised somewhere in the dark past the wire, had told him everything he needed to know about why that road, and that valley, had never really been his to hold.